I'm Marcus Hutton, actor for 40 years and voice artist for over 30 years. I'm also chair of the Equity Audio Committee, and I've been advocating for performers' rights, particularly in the AI space, for the past few years.
I'm Dr. Mathilde Pavie. I'm a lawyer and an expert in intellectual property, AI and ethics.
I'm Annette Rizzo, a broadcaster, university lecturer, voiceover and activist of long experience, but rather lighter on legal expertise. It's my job to ask the basic questions so no one else has to. You're welcome.
Welcome to the Last Human Voice podcast, exploring the moral, legal and ethical issues in artificial intelligence in the creative sectors and in performance synthesis.
We'll be focusing on the legal rights and protections available to artists and performers.
And looking at how AI affects us all, down to the very last human voice. In this episode, we're talking about agents. In what can be long contractual chains, agents act as intermediaries who seek work and they negotiate the fees and the contractual terms on behalf of the talent they represent. So the job of an agent requires, I suspect, a certain amount of charm, combined with obviously rock-solid negotiating skills, possibly more of an art than a science maybe. But agents are therefore often likely to be the servants of two masters, because they're positioned between the talent they represent and a paying client who wants to engage their artists and with whom they need to sustain ongoing relationships.
Now, our guest in this episode is well placed to talk about both the agent's roles and performers' rights. But before we speak to him, Mathilde, when we talk about a contractual chain, what do we mean? I mean, hiring talent for a gig isn't just as simple as arranging just one contract between the artist and the end client, is it?
No, it's not. And we talk about a chain, a contractual chain, because many parties are involved in creating content before it goes from creation all the way to the screen, the radio, or any other ways the audience may engage with your work. So in that chain, you have the content creator, the artist on one end. They may be represented by an agent. They then may be working with a recording studio or a producer. Sometimes those two are two separate ones. And then there may be also an end client. In that chain that I've just described, it's actually a quite simple one. There may be many more intermediaries like distributors, multiple producers that would be moving the content from one person to the other before it gets to the audience, the viewer, the spectator, the listener. And between those parties, every single time you have a contract. That contract can be oral. Most of the time that contract is written in a document or across multiple emails. What's important is that along that chain, two things need to flow in order for it to work well. Rights and payment coming with that, and information, because the end client will know they will know about the number of people, the number of places, the number of audience members they will want to share your content with. So they have the information. They also have the information about the budget. And that information needs to flow from the end client all the way back to the artist for the artist to know what rights they will agree and can transfer and assign, how much money they can charge for their time, but also for the usage of their rights. And in that chain, both the information can get lost sometimes, but what's really important is to track the rights and the informed consent that is given from one end to the chain that needs to flow all the way back. Why is it important? Is because there's a very old principle of law that we find across most Western jurisdictions, which is in Latin known as nemo plus juris. It means that you cannot pass on more rights than you have acquired from someone. So imagine you're selling rice. You will have in your pocket or in your bag a certain number of grain of rice, like say 10 grains of rice. You can't sell 11 or 12, right? You're limited to the number of grains of rice you've got in your pocket. It's the same with rights. So you can't pass on more rights as an intermediary than you have acquired from the person before. As the artist, you have all of the rights to pass on. And because there'll be layers of intermediaries coming after you, then they will want to make sure that they've acquired all of the rights that the end client or the person coming after them needs. Because if they're one short, it blocks the chain, it cuts it off, if you'd like. And the ones coming earlier in the chain can complain about their work or their content being not used according to the contract.
Okay, Matilda, you have kind of blown my mind by tipping the whole thing on its head. So I always presume that as artists, we are the bottom of the pile. So I just see everything coming, you've got the free flow from the top. And then by the time it gets down to us, it's like a tiny trickle if you're lucky. And you've just flipped it round the other way. I've never thought of it like that.
Well, it's a reverse that I think you think like that because of the budget, right? So the
Yeah.
budget usually starts with the end client and works its way down, and you get that trickle down effect. But it flows the other way, where the rights, on the other hand, flows from you to the end client.
Never thought about it in terms of rights.
And I suppose this is what we've talked about in other episodes, isn't it? That at the point of being engaged, we quite often are asked to give away all our rights because of this business of people needing certainty, not selling on 11. I was talking to a producer the other day who was talking about exactly that. He said that's the problem as a producer, is that they find it, but they're just sort of two up from us in the chain, but then there may be 3 or 4 people above them, and it's not always easy for them to sort of advocate for the people they're trying to engage, and it makes their job as engagers difficult as well.
Absolutely. And I think we're not helped with the fact that when intellectual property laws were written, the typical scenario we had in mind was artist, producer / distributor, the same entity wearing the two hats, and then the public. We didn't think about this layering on layering on layering of intermediaries that may also change over time, because you may be working with one producer and then 5 years later they're bought by another company, etc., which further complicates who has the rights and who has acquired the contracts that has the rights within them, and how far the content is traveling. And I think one of the big issue we have now is also one of the information. When the person or entity that has the information about what can you do or can't you do with a recording of a performance, for example, where can you use it, is divorced from the contract or is divorced from the person who's making use of that recording. And that's where you end up with this mess of, well, having the artist not happy with how their recording's used. You have an entity or company which may be acting in good faith and not realizing that there were strings attached or limitations attached to the recording according to the original collaborations agreement between the artist and the producing company. And a lack of information also to confirm that the contracts are being respected. And that's one of the things that the recent directive at the EU level, the copyright directive in the digital single market directive, was trying to address, is to create an obligation for users and distributors and clients to report back to artists about the usage of their work, to see if the contracts they've got in place track with reality, and also seeing whether they're getting their fair share in terms of remuneration.
Yeah, this is the transparency obligation, which is,
Yes.
I think probably clear communication that's the problem that we all have, is having maybe 5 or 6 parties communicating clearly, and indeed, our guest today is a theatrical agent who, they have to communicate very clearly with the talent and then with the people going up the chain, and that can be quite I would imagine, quite a daunting task.
I think that's one of the things that we really need to kind of emphasise at this point as well, isn't it? Because we've talked a lot over recent episodes about particularly focusing on voiceovers, not exclusively, but we've talked about effectively ourselves and our work a lot. But there are differences between the acting world and the voiceover world. And among voiceovers, there tend to be fewer who have dedicated representation, whereas most actors, it's a given, isn't it? You have your contracts looked at and your negotiations done by an agent.
Mm-hmm.
And so in that context, you're more likely as an actor to be hands off the process. So you've got that extra layer of protection from your agent. And that also requires quite a bit of trust, doesn't it? Kind of in acting in both ways. But, you trust your agent is going to be acting, in your best interest as an artist.
Yeah, and that can be sticky too, that relationship. So, I mean, within equity, obviously our union, and I'm sure that translates to other creative sectors too. Like, I mean, music or photography or fine art. I mean, the most vulnerable artists are the unrepresented ones the ones who don't have the luxury of an agent or a manager advocating for them. So, I mean, a lot of the union's work is about protecting unrepresented artists and giving them the tools, whether it's collective bargaining agreements or just education, to negotiate better for themselves.
I've definitely noticed an imbalance in my work between artists that have advocates by their side, whether those are unions, managers, agents, sometimes lawyers, even accountants or PR teams or PR staff, because having an advocate by your side means that you can manage to depersonalize the negotiation with the client. And so the advocate can take on that role of the bad guy, quote unquote, so to speak, and can perhaps take a bit more of the heat of the discussion or the negotiation with the client, whether the client is a producer, recording studio, another intermediary, or the end client themselves. And the advocate, whether it's a union or a person like an agent or a manager or a lawyer, doing these negotiations on the talent's behalf, can really help set and maintain your boundaries. And that's really helpful when you have a person like a talent with people pleasing tendencies. And I think we all do have that. I do myself, and I'm not an artist, but I've definitely noticed that trait in talents, because they are in the business of connecting and empathizing and, having compassion towards people, because that's how you tell stories. And as a result, as a talent, your skill set is not necessarily one of asserting your authority and boundaries, etc. And it's really hard to do that at the start of your career. And you get into a groove of going along with the client, going along with the flow. And I can understand that.
Yeah, and you want to be hired. But that's the other thing. You want to be hired,
Yeah.
and you want to be hired again. You want repeat work, so you just say
Obvious-
yes, of course, yes to everything.
Obviously.
Yeah, I think that's always, I mean, as a performer, you're always looking at the next job. It's a bit like, getting hired for this one, but you kind of want to be hired again, because, the best way to work is to have a sort of pool of people who'll employ you regularly, rather than having a sort of career made up of being employed once
Absolutely, yeah.
by people. Indeed, that does happen. I mean, a director said to me recently, he said, when I look at an actor's CV, I always look for whether they've done more than one job with that particular company or producer. He said, because that's usually a very good way of telling whether, I suppose partly whether they're amenable or easy to get on with, but also the fact that they didn't burn their bridges on a job by job basis. So I quickly had a look at my CV and I went, oh, good. There's quite the same names crop up quite a few times. So I think I'm okay.
When I hear that, I'm also hearing, like, what about the client not being accountable for not treating talent properly? That's kind of, it sounds like the accountability and the responsibility of keeping the relationship going is all or primarily on the talent, which I find unfair.
It's a really good point.
Yeah, I think it's true. I mean, there are so many unfairnesses. I mean, I think we could be here forever if we talked about the kind of iniquities of the whole thing. But yes, it's I suppose in terms of supply and demand, it's an oversaturated market. It's very hard to shake off, particularly in the beginning of your career. I think it's very hard to shake off that feeling that you're lucky to be working. That's something I think all performers suffer from. This idea that you're lucky to have a job. So don't complain.
Yeah, but also if you say no, there's
Yeah.
loads of people who are delighted and waiting to step into your shoes.
I hear that in almost every professional areas of work that's vocational. So you have that a lot in academia, even in medicine, saying, well, you're not happy with your pay, your working conditions. Well, know that there are a lot of other passionate people who'd be happy to step in. The firefighters say that as well. Like, all are told this is like, you're complaining, the job's not safe, you're not paid well. Well, know that there are loads of passionate and committed men and women who would happily step into your shoes. And that's not a reason. I think we need to separate the fact that you love your job from the fact that you should be paid less. And I'd like to add, because I think a couple of my clients have mentioned in the past how difficult it can be to negotiate your contract, which usually is a process that happens over a period of weeks or sometimes months, and the project starts. So you need to go into the recording studio or go on stage, go start rehearsal and all of that, start doing the job, knowing that a couple of bits of your contracts are not completely set, maybe usage, maybe the budget, maybe the number of hours, etc. There are outstanding points to negotiate with your producer, and at the same time you've got to start the gig, and knowing that you're going into that wearing the artistic hat, I need to show up, do the work, be completely there. And also I need to think about, when is it that I'm going to raise the fact that I'm not quite happy about paragraph 2.5 in the draft they send me? Should I ask at the break? Should I ask at the end? Should I wait until next week? And that's difficult to have that at the back of your mind. So if someone else can do that for you, that could be really helpful.
Yeah, I mean, the amount of jobs I've been on, and indeed we've heard this from artists who've been sort of felt stitched up by AI contracts, is that quite often you'll have started a job and the contract is pushed under your nose while you're doing it and saying, "Can you just sign this?" I've had a couple of times recently in the last year or two where I've said, "Sorry, no." I said, "I'll take the contract away." I mean, I've been handed contracts on film sets. I've been handed contracts in recording studios. Can you sign them right now? And I've said, "No, I need to take them away and have a look at them. Do you mind?" But that takes a certain amount of guts to do that, I think.
It also takes age and experience to some
Yeah.
extent, Marcus. I think that the younger you are and the less experienced you are, the more likely you are to find it very, very hard to say. And we all find it hard to say no, in different contexts. But I think that in particular is something where the older you get, frankly, the crankier you get, I think you're more likely to say, actually, let's just take a
Yeah.
pause here. But that's very hard. It's very hard as an individual.
And also that the pause is your friend. Do not reply to the email immediately. Take a beat, whether you delay it by a couple of hours or even the next day. Usually it doesn't require an immediate response, even though that may be your kind of automatic reflex or knee-jerk reaction to do so. I have that as well, and I always delay negotiation by half a day or the next day. By the way, anyone listening to me that I've negotiated with, now you know why I reply to you at 9 a.m. the next day.
Sleep on it. Always sleep on it.
Exactly.
Absolutely. Well, this is the great benefit, of course, as we're talking about agents today, of having an agent, because you can just say in that work environment, talk to my agent. Let me know what my agent says. I've used that one many, many times over the years.
On this, and just before we turn to and welcome our guest, I would say that when you're in a position when you've already started the job and the contract's not agreed, it's the best position for you, because the project started, the producer, the company's already invested in you, they've got other staff and crew going. So it becomes very, very expensive for them, or a lot more expensive for them to switch you out and find someone else to replace you. So it's likely that any reasonable requests or changes to the contract you make, you'll get, because it's too late for them to switch you off and, get someone else in.
But even without an agent, that just take a pause is brilliant advice, Mathilde. Thank you. So let us, in fact, talk to our guest, the agent, who is Daniel Hinchliffe. Daniel is managing director of the Soundcheck Group, which includes a UK talent agency for actors and performers in theatre, TV, film, and radio, and also looks after directors and choreographers. Soundcheck also provide PR services for key talent. Daniel started his theatrical life with the Royal Ballet School as a dancer, and then worked extensively as a performer in theatre, TV, and film for over a decade, appearing in many West End productions and at the RSC no less. Daniel then completed a history degree and began a new career in the music industry at Sony Music, where he was head of press and promotions, working with some of the biggest artists in the world, including, wait for it, Michael Jackson, Mariah Carey, and Dolly Parton. I'm impressed.
Yeah, and it doesn't stop there, because in 2011, Daniel set up Soundcheck PR in Soho, representing artists like Barbara Streisand and Celine Dion, before launching the Soundcheck agency in 2013. Now, 3 years later, in 2016, Soundcheck produced its first West End production, Murder Ballad, at the Arts Theatre, and it was nominated for both the Laurence Olivier Awards and the What's on Stage Awards. Daniel recently received a law degree from the University of Law and has just completed a master's degree in intellectual property law at the University of Leeds, specializing in copyright law and artificial intelligence, no less. So I'm sure he and I will have plenty to talk about. And I understand that Daniel has not stopped there because he's begun a PhD, and I want to hear more about that journey.
Daniel has, yes.
Well, look, I've got to declare an interest here, as the Soundcheck agency are my acting agent, so I'd better be on best behaviour today. Daniel, hello, welcome. Hello. Well, yes. Well, Daniel, look, since I only recently found out that you'd done this Masters in Law and that you were focusing on AI and performance synthesis for your PhD research. So I have wanted for you and Mathilde to meet, because of course you will have a lot to talk about. So in a rather public way, Mathilde, Daniel, meet each other. Hello. So over to Mathilde.
Well, I'm interested to know what, as an agent, got you interested in the law and what made you want to explore intellectual property as well, because there are other areas you could have kind of been interested in, given your background and your work. But tell me.
I think my interest started. One of my clients is Cliff Richard, and obviously he went through quite a traumatic ordeal with false accusations from the BBC, and I'm sure you know the story. So I spent quite a lot of time with him during the court proceedings. So I think that's where my interest in law started. And obviously that was about privacy, but well, amongst other things. So that wasn't IP. And then I did a law degree, and then I thought, how can I use it for my industry? So copyright is the obvious route for that, and other IP. But so I think that's why I thought I need to find a section of the law that works for me, because I didn't want to become a full-time lawyer, and I represent writers and creative clients, and obviously actors. So copyright is becoming more important to us, I believe. So then I did this master's, and then got interested. Obviously, AI has sort of become even more prevalent in the last 12 months. So then I wrote a dissertation about AI content and copyright infringement issues, which has led me to now starting this PhD specifically on machine music and infringement of copyright, and where we stand really as an industry, which is nowhere.
Yes. Well, right.
Currently.
Well, starting on the AI side of things, I mean, in the voiceover space, obviously, we've been battling this for quite a while. But I mean, just from an agent's point of view, are you starting to see AI clauses or performance synthesis requests appearing in film and TV negotiations for in-vision actors?
Yes,
even live work.
In all contracts, almost.
Wow.
And I sort of take any clause regarding AI, not with a pinch of salt, but I know there's no sort of legislation to back it up. I mean, contract law I've studied, but not extensively. But, I understand it enough to know that really just putting a clause in a contract doesn't really mean much. And the way it's written is often appallingly in contracts I'm seeing. So I can't imagine it stand up in any sort of court. A judge would just dismiss it. So
yeah.
So they're there, Marcus, but I don't think they're very powerful as clauses. I mean, equity. Really, I think you guys were involved, weren't you, with
yes,
AI?
Mathilde did the work.
Right,
Yeah.
Which is more useful to people, But I think that people are just writing nonsense in contracts about AI. They're just making it up, and of course, they're writing about something that hasn't happened yet. Almost, it just doesn't make sense, in my opinion, from a legal perspective. But it's sort of going against what we've all moved towards, which is getting away from this in perpetuity nonsense. It's actually going back towards that because it's saying it is.
So I think here it may be worth clarifying what we mean by AI clauses. Do we mean clauses that allow the use of AI on content, or do we mean clauses that exclude AI use on content? Because, for example, the equity AI clause is one that would exclude consent or permission to use. Exclude.
Yeah.
So is that what you mean? Exclude it.
But I think, Marcus, I mean, there's things about body scanning and things like that we're starting to see.
Mm-hmm.
Which is an inclusion, isn't it? They're sort of saying that should be allowed. But I think people are being asked whilst on film sets. I think it's not even a contractual problem that people are just being scanned.
Well, yes. In fact, I was on the Actors UK forum yesterday, and AI came up. Somebody said they'd been asked to do, and suddenly people were posting. There are some people on that forum who do essay work, And they were saying, yeah, I got scanned on blah, blah, blah. Nobody told us what was happening. We were just told to walk into this booth and be photographed. And it was
Marcus,
nuts.
can you just, for the people in the back row, can you just explain what SA work is,
Oh,
please?
sorry, supporting artists. So these are what traditionally were called extras. But they're really vulnerable because obviously, being able to sort of scan supernumeraries in scenes, perhaps who aren't speaking but are background artists, and then just being able to sort of cut and paste them and drop them into other scenes is obviously a huge cost saving for producers. But it seems to be happening on jobs without anybody being asked.
Yeah, and they already earn pitifully low money, don't they? Essays,
Oh, 80 quid a day. Yeah,
it's just awful. Then to sort of replace them, they don't even get that.
Yeah.
And that can be in any production, I believe. It doesn't have to be in the actual production they're working on. So yes, so Matilda, it's both inclusion and exclusion, I think we're talking about when it comes to AI.
Yes, I
Yeah.
agree, because so often a production will, or an AI clause coming from production will most often be one of, can I use your recordings to train an AI model and to synthesize, whichever other terminology may be involved. And it's actually one of the better contracts if they're at least explicit and express about it. Now, you knowing may not help you very much in you saying no, because those are two different things. But at least you're not looking at a case of a contract that has a buyout of full assignments of rights in perpetuity, etc., that will then be interpreted to include and cover AI in the future, or even in 2023, which is one of the main issues. And I think the anti-AI clauses, if we can call them that,
Yeah, let's call them that.
to clarify, I agree, a bit easier. They can work. I mean, they would work to exclude your permission, but they work from a legal standpoint, and it still needs to be enforced by the production after, and it still requires you finding out that it's not the case and it's not being respected in order for you to do anything about it, and then it requires resources for you to do anything about it. So they're not a magical solution, but they're a first step, and at least in negotiation they're helpful in finding out if it's part of the agenda of the production company all along than to use the content in that way. Because if you ask for one and they say absolutely not, we can't do that because actually we want to use your recordings or your materials in that way, then you find out sooner rather than later. And then whether they accept or not often depends. The answer is that, oh, but no, the end client wants all of the rights, including any AI use. And then we get into that business of the chain of contract, kind of locking or gridlocking the negotiation between the artist and the first line producer or the agent.
I mean, a problem is if we push back too hard on some of these clauses, we're in danger of losing the client the job, which is always a balance, with any sort of negotiation in this sort of world. So obviously you want the best deal possible for your client and the best financial offer and the best, if we're talking about rights, for example. But if we're talking about a superstar, then it's quite different, isn't it? If we're talking about a jobbing actor who's, on set for a couple of days or whatever, then, you are in danger of losing them the job, which is the last thing you want to do as an agent. But obviously we need to protect our clients, so I suppose that's always been the issue,
That's one of the things we were actually talking about amongst ourselves earlier on, which is the fact that as an agent, you're kind of this intermediary. So you've got this fine line to tread where you're advocating for your talent, but you're also serving the client. So I don't know how you do make that balance work.
I mean, most of the negotiations are with a casting director, not with anyone from the production office or team. So, and casting directors are very much on the side of actors. They also want the best deal for the actor, so it's easier if we're negotiating with a casting director. In commercials, sometimes you would negotiate direct. It'd be passed over, wouldn't it, to a production company?
Or to the ad agency, maybe.
Or to the ad agency. Often the ad agency, actually.
Yeah.
So that's different again. But yes, if you're negotiating with a casting director, everyone's on the side of the actor in that negotiation.
Yes, it's interesting. I mean, this is partly sort of in terms of this sort of chain of contractual chain. This is the problem. I mean, somebody gave me an example in video games the other day, which was that Microsoft bought Activision, who are a huge games publisher. Activision in turn bought Blizzard, who did World of Warcraft and these big games, and then became Activision Blizzard. Now, when they're looking for mocap or voiceover performers in the UK, they'll appoint an intermediary in the UK who can be a sort of casting / sound recording company, and they may be sort of tasked with providing 150,000 lines of dialogue for this game that can be played for years, who then has to go out to either another casting director or out to the agents, or worse, to the pay-to-play platforms, the sort of Mandys and Backstages and everything else. And you wind up with this complete lack of transparency and complete lack of communication from the sort of talent end and the Microsoft end. And I suppose that's a question. I mean, and given that I suppose the entity dictating the terms at the end of the day are probably going to be Microsoft. That's kind of where the buck stops in that situation.
I mean, there is a monopoly, isn't there, happening here? You know,
Yeah.
Which is the same as the music. If you look at the music industry, there's only 3 major players left. Because
Universal.
they bought up all the labels: Universal, Sony, and Warner. You know,
Yeah.
and I think the gaming industry is going in a very similar way. Which I'm amazed the EU allow it. If I'm honest, you know, from what I know about EU law, they hate monopoly. Am I right, Matilda? I mean,
Absolutely.
they have fined. They have fined
You
some
know,
of these companies, isn't they?
I mean, they do find some of them, but you know, they still sort of seem to be allowed to monopolise, which sort of goes against my understanding of EU law.
Yeah, I was going to say. I mean, given that there are these sort of global giants dictating terms, if you like, right down the whole kind of contract chain, how does that impact you as a negotiator? Because you know, I'm sure it's easier to negotiate for sort of names.
It is.
You know, you've got more room to maneuver. But for the jobbing actors, I suppose actors like me, you know, I might have a little bit more wiggle room than somebody who's just left drama school. But
Yes, you would.
it's definitely more difficult. So I mean, how do you? So do you think your job as an agent has got harder in recent years because of this?
I do, but I also think that casting directors, I'm coming back to casting directors because they really are on our side, and they will turn down a job if they feel the fee's too low for the actor. You know, they're really trying to make sure that everyone gets a good salary. You know, they really do care about it. And I know a lot of casting directors that turn down jobs. And unfortunately, then they're like in any industry, there will be casting directors that take those jobs, you know, but you know, the 2 big organizations, the CDG and the CDA, are really on this. And they will, the individual casting directors will turn down a job if they think the fee for the actor being offered is just not acceptable. So they're helping us out at that stage.
But there are the others. I mean, there are perhaps more rogue, should we say, casting directors. I mean, who you know, where you log onto Instagram and they're actually advertising on Instagram, or they're advertising on Fiverr.
For nothing, for pennies.
Yeah.
But of course, Marcus, as you know, actors don't like turning down work because it's hard to come by. You know,
exactly.
You know,
exactly.
and of course, you know, as in any industry, the higher paid jobs are perhaps the jobs you might not want to do, and the lower paid jobs often can be the ones that are most rewarding for a performer. You know, so that's another sort of conundrum, if you like.
Well, yes. I mean, I've mentioned this before. I mean, you know, the sort of 3 pots that you perhaps put your work into: cash, glory, piety, if you like.
I'm fascinated by what goes into piety, Marcus. What goes into piety?
Well, charitable acts, you know, maybe be doing a bit of voluntary union work like this. You know what I mean? The sort of the greater good sort of stuff. And there are definitely, you know, I definitely, you know, I sort of definitely think about my career, for want of a better word, but I would definitely say, you know, there are times that I, you know, could be pretty hard-nosed about commercial, for instance, if there was room with your agent to kind of negotiate that. But it's very difficult to, you know, especially you have to look at market practice and sectors and everything else, but it's very difficult to establish, you know, if you were to put a computer on this and go, how much should an actor be paid? You have to go, well, it varies, depends on the gig, depends how much you want to do it, depends on all sorts. But it's that agency, it's that feeling of choice.
Yes, quite. I mean, that's sort of what I'm talking about. Yeah, and of course, the engagement fee is a relatively new term, isn't it? You know, that's sort of only crept in recently, and that's entirely dependent on your body of work. So coming back to negotiation, if you're an actor straight out of drama school, your engagement fee is going to be low, and there's nothing we can do about that. You know, because you're inexperienced.
Can I ask the basic question? Because I'm a voiceover, I'm not an actor. So what does the engagement fee signify? What does that entail?
Well, it's sort of a buyout, really, and it's what you will get, and it's quite a complicated sort of mathematical system of what you will get to act in that episode, let's say, if it's a television programme. So let's say your engagement fee will be £1,500, and then they'll add on holiday pay and a buyout for certain countries, and for certain, if say streaming, for certain streaming networks, etc. And then it's all a final sum, and that is what you will get for doing that job, and that is the only fee you will get. So it doesn't really mean engagement. Engagement fee is quite a misleading term for it. Essentially, it's your salary for that role.
That's really interesting. And it was one of the questions actually I was going to ask was exactly that, because we were talking about buyouts in a previous episode. It was the last episode that we did.
Yeah.
So that was going to be my question, which was outside of, the existing agreements with SAG-AFTRA in the US and Equity in the UK, is as an agent, is that something that you're seeing more, is the request for buyout? It sounds like you are, just calling it something different.
Especially in television. And I think that is, since the streaming giants have sort of dominated, you see almost every television contract, I'm going to put my neck out and say, is now a buyout, pretty much.
Really?
Interesting.
But you have to do that in conjunction. I'll just throw that in. You have to do that in conjunction with the union. Otherwise, the Competition and Markets Authority will down your throats. So you've got to sort of, this is a difficult thing. That
I mean, organisational bodies make our work easier. So the PMA, for example, that the majority of decent agents are a member of.
That's the Personal Managers Association.
Before I jump in and ask,
yeah, we all sort of abide by the same rules, So I suppose that in itself is a collective agreement, because we've all said that we will not do this and we will do that, and
Yeah, guidelines, and you can't talk about money and all that kind of stuff. So there are very set rules about how organising, associations organise themselves outside of unions and that kind of thing. But it's a tricky one, which is why I think in the UK, and I'm sure in America as well, Equity can come in for quite a lot of flack, because people are tearing their hair out because they're not allowed to kind of organise amongst themselves. So whereas a union is, so that's a tricky one. I mean, I suppose when I was talking about collective agreements, I mean, one of the things that collective agreements do is they set a floor, a minimum rates of pay. But of course, as Annette and I and Matilda have discussed many times, those minimum rates, they become the rates.
And they're low.
And they're
in my opinion, they're low.
Yeah.
Certainly compared to American minimums.
Exactly.
We're a lot lower.
Yeah, well, that opens another question, really, because given that American SAG-AFTRA rates are generally higher, their minimum rates are higher than here.
And we're talking on the day that the strike ends.
Well, exactly, of course. Exactly.
Yes.
We were just about to mention that. I mean, obviously, AA played a very central role in that. I mean, it's an interesting. I mean, just look at theatre. Just take away TV and film and everything else. Okay. I mean, one of the things that came up recently was that Equity had really, to get a decent rise in West End minimums, they had to work really, really hard to get those. But they
introduced the tiers with capacities. Didn't they?
They did. But
which I'm not fond of.
The Equity UK West End minimum is about half what the Broadway minimum is.
I think it's less than half, Marcus.
And
I think the Broadway minimum is $1,800. I think the West End minimum is about 500
quid now. It's $750 or something now.
Is it? Yeah. But I think for a smaller theatre, which is why I brought
I did a bit of use my sort of nerdy head. I did some research on ticket prices and on capacity and all of that, and I thought, hang on, this is exactly the same business model. There's no difference between the West End business model and the Broadway model. And in fact, the ticket price percentages are not that out, maybe 15 or 20%, and capacities on Broadway are smaller.
We've caught up with Broadway, not in a good way, haven't we, with ticket prices?
Yeah. So
we used to be spectacularly less. It was about half price, and now it's about the same.
Well, yeah, you can pay 100 quid for a theatre ticket in the West End.
You can pay $250 for Cabaret, for example, for a front row seat.
That's crazy, isn't it? I mean,
are you saying that the tickets have gone up?
Tickets have gone up dramatically, and salaries haven't. So I'll give you an example. When I was in the original cast of Grease the Musical in 1993 at the Dominion Theatre, I was on £450 a week in 1993. Now, the same show has just been back to the same theatre 30 years on, and I think the minimum is about 700. So it's gone up only 250 quid, less than, in 30 years. Like that should have tripled, right? Or
Yeah.
so top ticket price in 1992 was 20 quid. Top ticket price now is 150. So there's something gone wrong here.
Well, exactly. I mean, something has gone wrong, and I mean
Is it
this is not
theatre rent? Is it theatre rent? I've got a feeling it might be theatre
no,
rent.
because a lot of the producers, a lot of those big producing groups own the theatres, so it's not to do with that either. There's not the business model's the same, and I
mean that's another monopoly, by the way. There's only really 3 people own all of the West End theatres.
Yeah, and so they are dictating.
Yeah.
Well, Lloyd Webber Group.
So you have Lloyd Webber's group, you have Cameron McIntosh's group, you have Nika Burns's group, NIMAX, and they essentially own the West End between them.
Yeah. This is the thing. I mean, monopolies, big, Microsoft, Google, whatever. I mean, having their fingers in entertainment pies and everything. Will Netflix wind up being sold to one of them in the end? I mean, but what? I mean, from the contractual sort of point of view, what does this? I mean, without us getting into sort of having theatre chat, what does this look like to you from the outside?
From a legal perspective?
Yeah.
Well, the problem of contract law is that it's looking at the unit of the relationship. It's not looking at the market dynamics, which is what you describe. That actually very few areas of law look at that. And one of them is competition law. And it will come in when concentration of wealth or control, that usually is around prices, but also it can be on other contractual terms or resources, access to resources is so concentrated that no competition or free competition is happening, and it's rigging the market basically, usually to worsen the public interest by making the prices go up or the quality of the services or goods offered go down. Contract law still operates on the basis of freedom of contract. So until you breach a major area of law, a major legal standard, on you go, you do what you want. And that's the main tool we use to move intellectual property from one person to the next, to remunerate people, to implement working conditions. Obviously, you mentioned collective conventions or collectively bargained agreements will bring another set of parameters that those individual contracts will need to respect. But those conventions or collectively bargained agreements are only a framework contract. They're just another contract. So contract law doesn't have much to say about what you've just described, and that really shapes the reality of an actor or of a producer or of an agent, working between the two.
It's interesting though, isn't it? With that, I mean, back to the AI thing. I mean, with that ABBA show, and other theatre. I mean, I did some work at Chichester Festival Theatre a couple of years ago, and I got talking to their digital technologies guy there. Really interesting, and he was getting really excited about the possibility of sort of holographic projections and mixing live performers with AI generated performers and everything else. And so I think at the moment the conversation's about audio and about film and TV, but given like the ABBA show, I can see it starting to sort of creep into the live space.
Yeah, I mean, I've been involved with quite a few live shows using holograms. There was an Elvis Presley tour I was involved with, Roy Orbison, and it's quite bizarre, but it's not very good currently. So, no. For example, with the Elvis Presley one with the Royal Philharmonic Orchestra, once Elvis's hologram is on stage, it can't really move.
Yeah.
Because of the way it's set up, and the orchestra couldn't be behind the hologram. So the orchestra was sort of on either side. It looked very odd.
Yeah, it's kind of a bit ghosty, isn't it? It's kind of got that.
It's a bit ghosty.
Yeah,
it's a bit ghosty.
Absolutely.
And with the ABBA one is apparently, I don't know how much it's cost, but they've still not recouped, and it sells out.
Wow.
7
Yeah, I've heard that recouped. It's massively expensive.
They're still not recouped. So you look at it must have been in the tens of millions to get it right.
So there you go, folks. We're still cheaper. The real thing. We're still cheaper for the time being.
The humans. And more adaptable, and we can fit all venues.
And we can travel.
Yeah.
Exactly. So knowing that, do you recommend your artists, especially your big names, to do work in AI and to explore holograms or cloning, whether it's of their voice or other parts of their performances, to diversify their income, or maybe to diversify the type of art or artistic projects they may be into?
I think I do, and I think we should be looking at sort of joint ventures already, so that people who are cloned, who are using sort of new technologies are part of it. You know, they're part of the process early on. So I think some Hollywood actors are already doing this, aren't they? And they're giving permission to companies, and
They
and they're
are.
you know and they're getting some money. You know, so it's all sort of legit from the very start. You know, it's a proper joint venture.
But then for that to be another string to your bow, as opposed to a threat or major backdoor open into, your residuals or whatever else, what terms should they think about, or what aspects should they think about asking or negotiating before they embark upon those
Well,
projects?
I think just to be involved at the very top, because if you give permission to someone, as opposed to someone infringing on your rights, surely you should at some point almost give permission, as long as you are getting something back for that, which is all we do anyway, isn't it? All we do is ask for money for our services, you know. So I think we just need to come up with some sort of structure, whereas every time Michael Douglas's voice is used in something, he gets 50% of the fee, or whatever, you know, or whatever it might be. Otherwise, they're just going to do it, right? Otherwise, it's just going to happen without your consent.
But Daniel, you are very knowledgeable about this. You've studied, so now you've got a degree, you've got a master's degree, you're doing a PhD. And I'm not suggesting for a moment that other agents out there aren't obviously incredibly professional and, and know what they're
Of
doing. But
course.
how are you sensing that other agents, without naming names, obviously,
Yes.
are actually across this in the way that they would need
No.
to be? No, that's what
No.
worries me.
And there's an enormous amount of fear. I see people's faces sort of go almost waxen when artificial intelligence is mentioned, because agents like to know, they're a bit like GPs agents, right? They know a lot of things, but nothing in great depth, you know? And I'm sorry if there's any GPs listening, but you know what I mean? You know, they're sort of generalists, aren't they? You know,
Yes.
and agents like to think they know a little bit about everything, and probably don't know a huge amount about anything, but know a lot of things. But this is just, anyone that asks me about artificial intelligence, and I can talk for hours about it, but I can see them either glaze over because they're bored, or look at me with absolute fear. I think the media doesn't help. It's almost like an invasion. It's almost like this horrible sort of language that's being used.
The media has polarized it between you're either in the fear, doom and gloom, about to die category, or you're in the enthusiastic, nothing can go wrong, get on board before the train leaves you behind type.
It's going to cure cancer. It's going to stop
End
global
of
warming.
poverty.
You want all the other answers.
It's funny, yeah. I was listening to a radio phone-in the other day, and they were talking about it. I only caught the end of it, but one of the callers was terrified about the Terminator coming in and killing everybody, and the next one was saying, "Look, guys, actually, what I think you need to be concerned about is really what we're concerned about, which is not that it's taking everybody's jobs, but that it will be coming for jobs, but it needs to, we need the proper controls in place to make sure everybody's looked after or everybody's paid." And the presenter was totally blown away by this. What, you think that's more danger to us, and that's a bigger problem than everybody being murdered by a Terminator? And when the caller said, yeah, that is what I'm concerned about, there was almost kind of no understanding. Like, really? Perplexity.
Fascinating.
You're concerned about that? Yeah.
I went to a lecture last week with Richard Susskind. Do you know him, Mathilde?
Yes.
And there's an amazing book he wrote this son called The Future of the Professions, and it's literally about that. And it's about which industries will be most impacted, which industries will sort of almost be obliterated, or will look different. Yeah. And law is one of them. Law's one of the ones that's going to be badly affected. According to his predictions.
Absolutely. I think Benjamin Field, who's a filmmaker and producer who uses AI ethically in his work, and recently launched the production company Deep Fusions, actually, as of a few weeks ago, summarizes it quite well when he says AI is not going to replace your job. What's more likely is that someone who knows about AI will replace or take your job.
Yeah.
And that, I think, is very likely across almost sectors,
almost all professions. Yeah.
And going back to the question earlier, I think about agents and how up to date they are on AI and other aspects of the contracts that may matter now that we're in this new world that has AI, and it's fairly effective at what it does, especially in voice or performance synthesization. I think in my experience, some of the worst contractual situation I've seen were brokered through or by an agent. And I think I say worse, not because the terms are particularly unusual, but I think because the talent didn't look at the contract because it was presented to them by an agent. So they didn't go back and check the ins and outs of the project.
Yeah.
And later they find out, they're like, oh my God, this thing was a synthesization project.
Yeah, it's your fault, Daniel.
But just basic things like contract law, as soon as you start negotiating, that original offer, of course, is void, right?
Is dead.
Is dead. And I would imagine that 98% of agents don't understand that very basic rule of contract law.
I would agree.
Yeah. So already, the fact you're saying we need more money or we don't like that, so, already they can walk away.
How, as an agent, how much of a take it or leave it do you get? And do you always have a maneuver to negotiate as the agent?
You always have some maneuver. The only time you don't have a maneuver is when people bring in MFN, or
which
if they
MFN
favoured nations, most favoured nations,
yes.
Or if it's somewhere like the Donmar or the Almeida or something, and they literally have a set cast rate that everyone's on, so they're the only situations where you don't negotiate. I mean, every single commercial deal is negotiable. Every deal for an actor playing a role in theatre is negotiable. And like we sort of touched upon earlier, if you're negotiating for a name, you can you can push it as far as you dare.
It always used to be. I mean, when I started acting, it used to be that a sign of a good agent was seen as someone who would negotiate their commission. They would negotiate their commission.
I think if you can add 10% on.
Yeah. So if there was an equity minimum, because at the moment you can be in a situation where, say, the equity minimum is £650 a week. Well, to the artist, that can be 90 quid off that. That can be £550 a week because the 10% comes off. So if your agent is able to get it to 750 quid a week and get their commission off, at least you've wound up with the minimum. And
I think it's a good basic rule, that.
Yeah.
And because I've produced work, I understand that there are budgets and there are P&Ls and there are margins, and you can't push it too far, can you? But you do know that the offer that comes in, normally there is some room to move up.
And how do you know how much room? Do you wet your finger, put it in the air and see? Is it a gut instinct?
Mathilde, you do a little bit just wait.
Fine art.
I think so. And I think you have to look at what it is and where it is and who's producing it. And if it's in a barn in Yorkshire with a brand new producer, you haven't got much to go with. If it's Sunset Boulevard with Nicole Scherzinger, you know that there's money in the pot, right? I think it's just experience that. But sometimes it literally is, especially when you start talking about residuals and things for commercials, and you're talking about options for year 2 and year 3, etc. If it's Coca-Cola, we had a client in McDonald's ad recently, so there's money, so I think you feel a bit braver, don't you, if it's a global company like McDonald's, you think, well, they can afford a couple of grand,
Yeah, and the exposure is likely to be higher as well. I mean,
everything's
the bigger
higher,
the brand, the bigger the exposure, the bigger the exploitation fee and everything else. Yeah,
and actually, commercials are paying really well again.
Yeah, after hitting a low. I mean, I think that for unrepresented talent, and I suppose I've been more since doing stuff with equity, I'm much more aware of how, particularly in the voiceover sector, just how, because so many people rely on the pay-to-plays, the Mandys, Spotlight's a different thing because Spotlight is, an industry thing and agents participate in that. But when you're getting onto Backstage or Star Now or Mandy or these things, Fiverr, it's the complete Wild West. And how do you think, as an agent, how do you feel about those platforms? Let's leave Spotlight out of it.
We don't use them, and we ask our.
No, I know you don't use them, but how do you feel about them as sort of competition for you, if you know what I mean? Because they cut you out of the loop, don't they?
Yeah, we ask our clients not to use them, but like you say, they sort of take agents out of the equation. I just think Wild West is probably a good analogy. I think it's dangerous to do it as an actor. I would advise someone just, to get a temp job rather than do that if they need the money. I think it's dangerous, and
you should read Mathilde's research on pay-to-plays that she did 6 or 7 years ago. It's very fascinating.
I will. There's health and safety issues. It's not just, sort of money and contractual things. Some of these places might be dangerous places to work. I really would advise people not to go near them. But I suppose it's almost like a different industry, that isn't it, to what we're talking about.
But for a lot of people, they see that as the industry. I mean, Annette, would you say in the voice sector, that's true, isn't it?
Yeah, very much so. I think particularly for the newer people who are coming in, I think we're back to that difficulty. If you're working in theatre, you have people who are experienced, who are physically around you, and you can talk to them. If you're coming in as a voiceover, all you've got really, or for very often, what you've got is online companies that are selling you coaching. And you've got online marketplaces that are promising you that you'll be able to earn six-figure salaries, while in your pajamas without leaving your home. And
Yeah,
it's
yeah,
it's snake oil, but it's really appealing. It's really alluring for a lot of people, and it's working. I mean, I don't think
right.
it's not getting people the work, but it's certainly bringing people into the platforms and bringing people into these coaching companies, some of which are more reputable than others, shall we say? So yeah,
Well, I think there's a burgeoning career in self-tapes, isn't there? So
Yeah.
people, set up businesses where they'll do this, help you with your self-tape, but that's just another expense for an actor, isn't it? Every time you get a car scene, you're spending 50 quid to pop to a studio. It's crazy if you think about it.
But yeah, and I see your marketplace concern, and I raise it with AI because now a lot of AI cloning companies are moving towards creating a marketplace as part of their cloning services, so that you would have your clone on the marketplace accessible on a need to use basis or pay to play basis by clients and end clients, engagers, etc.
We know that particularly, I think, with this business of AI now being part of these pay to plays and so many people coming in this way, I think those of us who've been established for a bit longer, I think we're already seeing some of the people that we have worked with for a long time talking about the fact that they think that the body of work is shrinking. That the work just isn't available because it's already going to AI. So, are you as agents? Are you seeing this?
Not yet, but I think voiceover is quite different. You're sort of ahead of us, I think.
It's one of those things where I'd rather not be ahead for a change.
Quite. Yes, probably not a race you want to lead.
No, absolutely. So why do you think I mean, obviously in theatre, I suppose it's gonna take more time,
Yes,
but
yeah.
do you think that do you have a plan? Are agents talking about it, those who aren't frozen like deer in the headlights? Is there a plan for the future?
There's no sort of plan legally, is there? And there's no sort of plan. I mean, everyone's talking about it, so I suppose everyone's now aware of it. And organisations like Equity and the PMA and Spotlight are doing things in that space.
Mm.
The issue is, so actors are unique, aren't they? That's sort of part of
Yep.
what being an actor is. And my theory is it's going to take away uniqueness. AI. And I don't know how you stop that. I mean, I don't know how you stop AI. And I think everyone's surprised at how quickly it's accelerated over the last 12 months. So goodness knows what's going to look like in 4 years. I think live performers are relatively safe. I think big names are safe. I think it's the day players that are the people we need to care for the most.
So I have a working theory on why AI is impacting the sector so much, is that it's coming on top of fairly poor contractual standards and levels of pay. It's the
Yes.
combination of the two that's like the lethal
Yes, you're
combination
right.
here. So are we like shaking the house so hard that at some point actually we're going to need to rebuild the foundations from the ground up, because we're going to come to
I hope so, Matilda.
That's my optimistic. I'm hoping for such a crash that actually we're going to have to reset, and maybe we'll get better standards across the board, not just in voiceover, and maybe video games next, because there's so much voice work in them.
Yeah.
Not just voice work, but a lot of it is based on voice work. I'm hoping that too.
I think you're right, but the gaming industry is as affected, if not more, than the voiceover agents, voiceover world. And anything motion capture, is already impacted.
And it's not actors, I think, in the video games. When you hear about the working conditions and the pay for programmers and code developers, some of them do very well, obviously, like you have top talents everywhere, but most of them are working on really difficult contracts and conditions, and AI is going to kind of shake that pretty hard.
Yeah, I mean, I VFX artists are starting to unionize, which they hadn't done before. I mean, but both my kids. I mean, my daughter's doing a photography degree at the moment at LCC, and of course, the whole business this week. I had a long ding-dong that came up about using AI in their work, and I got very cross, actually, about the direction. There's no instruction on her course, and this goes for the drama schools, and it goes for the art schools and music schools and everything else. They don't have copyright module, which is vital for whether they're going to. I mean, I was trying to explain to my daughter the other day. I said, look, if you take a picture for the Guardian newspaper and they pay you £300 and you assign all your rights to them, and that picture is hot, in the news or whatever, they can syndicate that around the world without you getting paid, or you can have a licensing agreement for which you could be paid thousands. And she said, no one's teaching us that. So education is a really big part of all it, even for agents, clearly. I mean, Mathilde, this is where everybody needs Mathilde, or you now.
Yeah, no, we did that forum recently, Marcus, didn't we? And someone in the audience asked me a question about how can I prepare for the future, and I said, learn about copyright. That's my advice to anyone that's challenged by AI, because that's where it's going to sit, isn't it? This is the area that it's going to challenge. Everyone should do copyright law. It almost should be an A-level subject. I don't know why it's not taught more widely. And the growth of it's insane, isn't it? It's all anyone talks about now. It's leaving the others behind.
IP is kind of everything.
IP is it.
Daniel, what if I'm a new artist seeking representation? How do I know if I've got a good one who knows what they're doing?
Agent-wise?
Yeah.
Yeah. Well, I think don't go to anyone that's not a part of the PMA. I think that, and when people come to me, to my agency and talk to some of the agents, and I always tell them to say, it doesn't matter if you don't join us, but do join someone that's with the PMA. That would be my golden rule. Because it just means that, like I said earlier, we all adhere to similar sort of guidelines and standards.
There are standards, and there's practices. I mean, my son, all the way through university, he's a model, and he's worked all over the world as a model. And modeling contracts are some of the most exploitative contracts I have ever. It is horrendous, that industry, and partly because models, well, Daniel and Mathilde, they're not covered by performers' rights, are they? Because they're not
true. I've
not
written
true.
2 papers on this.
See, Mathilde, always, every time I say something, Mathilde, I'm so glad. Yeah, right. Okay, go on.
I mean, actually, those were like my first papers coming out as an academic. So unlike kind of received notions, although models or runway models are not typically understood as performers in the conventional sense of the word, the way the law defined performers is so broad that it's very likely that most models will class as a protected performers. And on that, Richard Arnold is the authority and the standing judge, although writing extrajudicially, agrees. And it's a little thank you to international treaties that have gone quite broad on the definition, forcing national countries or countries at the national level to at least protect it in that way. And one country actually that excludes models from the group of performers is France. And I would argue, and others with me, say that actually they're breaching international conventions on that. But the UK hasn't. We haven't had a case where a court went to exclude a model from the category of performers. So equity can do much more with models than they already do, and they can do the same with reality TV performers who's driving a lot of money.
Yeah, social media influencers who are being ripped off all over the place.
I'm feeling a new episode coming on.
Yes.
Oh no, there are so many episodes of it. I mean, Daniel could probably keep you here for hours, because once you start getting into iniquities, I know, and those people are going to fall asleep listening to this. My daughter said the other day, she said, "Dad, I've tried listening to your podcast, but I keep falling asleep." So, thanks. It's really good for getting me to sleep.
That is an edit point if ever I heard it, Marcus.
Yeah.
That's a good.
Listen to us, we go on and on. We're really exciting.
That's a good way to end.
No, Daniel, thank you so much for your time. I think we really do need to let you go, but thank you so much for joining us. It has been fascinating, and actually it's been wider ranging than I was anticipating. So thank you so much for spending the time with us.
You're very welcome.
We hope we've made the role of a talent agent in the entertainment industry clearer to our listeners. And as always, our aim is not to give legal professional advice, but to offer some guidance and information as we talk through some of the biggest issues around AI.
There will be another fresh episode in 2 weeks' time, and we have got lots of ideas, things we're planning to cover. But if there is an issue or a question that you'd like us to address, then you can get in touch via X or Instagram. Do please follow us if you haven't already. You can search for @LHV Podcast. And if you've enjoyed listening, then do please leave us a review on whatever platform you have found us on. Thank you for listening to The Last Human Voice.